we'll work on getting that done.
Okay. So I do want to let everyone know who's on the call that we are going to record these meetings, and we have been in the past, and obviously I just turned on the recorder for this meeting as well. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. I thought we were all going to be back in the offices here, and unfortunately it looks like we're all still trying to work out of our houses. And good morning, Steve.
I'm here.
Good morning. I'll go through a list of everyone who's here in just a bit, and make sure everyone's aware of.
Ian, good morning.
Morning, Steve.
We're going to try putting it on the screen. Let's see here. Let me see if I can put it on the screen here.
Should I close that door?
Yeah. Oh. Got it. Oh. Yeah, I understand your challenge here now.
I was telling the group I have a house full of teenagers right now, so I'm muting myself as much as possible.
Okay, so I've got 10:01, Deanna. Do you want to go ahead and get started? And I'll go through the roll here, and I want to remind everybody that has joined that we are recording these meetings.
What? Can you hear fine? Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys.
About what?
I'm not being close to everything.
Steve, I might ask you to mute yourself. Thank you, Steve. So let me just go through everyone who's on the call so everyone is aware. We've got myself and Alex Pitlack from Geocentech, Brandon Spain, and I'm just going in the order that they're listed here. Obviously, Deanna Jackson with Tri-County, Kathy Wood McLaughlin, and if I butcher your name, please correct me, but Tim Keltson, and Megan, and I'm not sure, Megan, how you pronounce your last name. Is it Ciccone? Am I saying that right?
It's Shequin.
Shequin, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I apologize. And then Stacy Ann, and then Steve Jackson. And Steve, I don't know if you have anyone else in the
I have Mark's here with me.
Okay.
Yes, so Melissa.
All right. Welcome, Mark. Oh, and it looks like Carol Combs just joined us as well. Hi, Carol.
Hello.
So just as a reminder, we are being recorded for these calls. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm hoping everyone has a copy of the agenda, but one of the first item we have is some updates on Sigma, which we always try to do for this group and let you know what's going on. There's lots of Sigma meetings out there, as you all know, and we all can't be at all of them. So I figure this is a good time to kind of get the group caught up on what's happening that's pertinent to Tri-County. The first one is that the Thule Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee met. And as I just mentioned, there's so many meetings going on. I personally wasn't able to attend, but Alex Pitlack from our office was able to attend. And Alex, I'm going to ask you to maybe give the group a quick update on some of the pertinent information that was discussed at that meeting.
You got it. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to mostly talk about the subsidence update and the model updates. So with the subsidence update, Four Creeks mentioned that the monitoring network is now underway. The existing subsidence monitoring points were from the Bryant-Kern Canal, and they are currently installing new benchmarks for the subsidence monitoring network. And those will be used to create a baseline to compare and respond for future Sigma implementation. So the next component was the model updates. So during the meeting, they mentioned that after the GSP was updated and submitted, comments were received, and it was realized that the model needed some updates. Most of those updates were for model calibrations and to run future scenarios. One critical thing of the update was to extend the calibration period to September 2019. So this would allow the model to have 33 years of data. Next, the model was updated for 3 major components. The first component is the water budget. The model grouped similar land uses and water sources and used this to determine groundwater pumping stresses in the area. So by doing this, they were able to districtize the stresses. So majority of these refinements were done in Eastern Tule, Lower Tule, and Pixley. There were some minor changes in Tri-County, but those 3 GSAs were mostly focused on. The second component was to incorporate the ITRC metric data from Cal Poly, and this was used for consumptive use and precipitation from 1992 to 2019. And this uses the Williamson method to estimate precipitation and recharge. The third component for the model update was for refinement of the ag wells in the model. The original model only had 1 well per square mile, and that was set at 1 specific perforation zone. The update now includes 4 wells per square mile with 1 rotating perforation interval. So now they're able to target the shallow, the middle, and the deep parts of the aquifer. And so they discussed that with these calibration targets, they'll be able to use real life data to double check how the model is doing. There were some minor changes that they added to the model, including refining the Porterville water budget, some bedrock outcrops in Porterville, refined the Deer Creek near Terabella, and they incorporated additional recharge basins in Allensworth municipal pumping data. They did, however, give us a schedule of deliverables. So that meeting was about last week. So sometime this week, they stated that the model calibration should be complete. And they project to have some forward projections in about 3 to 4 weeks. And then that should be about it.
Thank you, Alex. And Steve, you were at that meeting. I think both you and maybe Mark were. Is there anything you want to add, Steve, in addition to what Alex had?
I would only add, Amir, that again, I think it goes back to how the model was calibrated with our safe yield. I don't think we really got into that at all, but that's a continuing discussion I think we're having internally here, and how we how that was handled within the basin, and it's going to be interesting. I would say to get the model updated and see what that does, because I think we still have a lot of gaps, and I think you have mentioned, Amir, to us that the model needs quite a bit of work still.
So Steve's right. It's interesting that they're updating some of the information in Eastern Tule. Bob and I, as we were looking at some of the modeling results over the last few weeks, have noted that some of the calibrations in Eastern Tule in particular were 50, 60 feet off of what is actually happening in reality, what the model predicted and what the reality was. It was showing water levels being substantially lower than what they actually are, which obviously affects the groundwater flow directions and things of that nature. So again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the model is poor or anything like that. It just needs further refinement. So keep that in mind, because one of the items we're going to talk about here in a little bit is the allocation, and some of the numbers we're talking about for the allocation have been taken directly out of the model, and I do believe that the model needs some additional refinement and further calibration based on actual water level data and not what was just predicted. And see if that calibration is actually occurring.
Hey, Amir, this is Kathy. I just have a quick question.
Sure.
I'm not with my photo on here. With regard to this model and subsidence, is it still the focus for the Frank Kern Canal? I mean, I know some funding came from them, but is the focus still in the upper Tule and the focus on the subsidence impacts on the Frank Kern Canal, or is this really a subbasin wide? Just curious.
So there are benchmarks for subsidence across the entire subbasin, Kathy. There is a map that was included in the information that Alex sent to me, and that's what I'm glancing down at. But there is a number of points along the canal itself. There's all up and down the entire length of the canal. So it looks like, and Alex, maybe you can talk to this. The new benchmarks that were being installed, are they across the entire subbasin, or are they primarily along the Frank Kern Canal? And give me 1 second, I'm going to close my door before we get a little bit of noise here.
Yeah, I'm actually going to see if I can share it with you all. This is my first time trying to share on Teams, so forgive me with this. Now I see the struggle. Yeah, actually, does that show the map?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these
So it looks
blue,
like most of, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. The blue points are all the new points that Four Creeks is installing. So it's throughout that subbasin. And then the red is the Frank Kern Canal existing benchmarks.
Yeah, so Kathy, just to answer your question, it really does look like a lot of the existing work was already done on the canal, and some of the new focus is across the entire subbasin.
Yeah, we saw something going in south of the wetlands at on our BLM property, and I think that's that point that's down there south of Alpaugh, because I heard it was a monitoring well, and we were more than happy to offer up some of our old wells for monitoring, but it looks like we've got a site down there. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, good. Next item on the agenda, if there aren't any other questions, is the Land IQ update. And Deanna, do you want to cover that? And I'll add anything at the end.
Sure. So I spoke with Joel at the end of last week, and he said that, of course, we have the two weather stations have already been installed. The third one, I believe, was going to be installed this week in the Pistachio field for Tri-County Water Authority. And I think he said we would have 90 weather stations in and around the Tule subbasin, and he was feeling pretty confident that that the data was going to be refined and be pretty good moving forward. We did receive data sets for May. They come a month afterwards. So for May, we get them at the end of June. So for June, we should be receiving data sets, or for June, we should be receiving the data sets at the end of July. I sent those data sets on to Amir to look at, so maybe he can touch on, what he sees from those. And I don't know how complete they were for May. So that's where we are. I'm excited to start looking at those data sets and seeing how we're going to utilize them as we move forward. Amir, did you have, I don't know how much you've looked at those or where you're at with the data sets so far.
Yeah, we actually did look at them. And I think, as I mentioned before everybody got on, I was actually on the phone with Joel. We've been playing telephone tag, and I was hoping to clarify a few things before this meeting. And unfortunately, he and I weren't able to connect. But so the information that Land IQ basically sent was the ET data for 1 month. And they are also using crop distribution information from 2019. And that was one of my questions that I had for him, is when we were going to start lining up the crop distribution data with the current ET data. And I want to clarify that with him so that by the time the annual report goes out in for this year in April of next year, we want to make sure that we're using and all that information matches up. But having said all that, you know, what part of that is to calculate then groundwater extraction and the estimated groundwater extraction. So you're taking the ET data, we're taking the land use data, and going to calculate a water extraction number for you. And I'd like to get those numbers as quickly as we can so that we can kind of run them by some of the stakeholders and the landowners and make sure that it makes sense, and that you agree with the values that are being reported, because these are the values that are going to end up going to the state. And we want, you know, as several of you know, Deanna and I were not completely satisfied, to put it mildly, about the last annual report. There was a lot of estimates in there. And so we're trying to get this year's, the 2020 data to nail down a little bit more. And obviously, that was one of the reasons that the entire subbasin went to Land IQ and is using them consistently across the basin. So as I get some more information, as we get the next round of data, I want to start to share some of that with this group and have you guys, especially some of the stakeholders, be able to comment on whether that seems to be, you know, in line with what your expectations are based on what you know about the you know, the crop needs in that areas. So you know, one data point obviously does not make a trend. So as we start to get some more of this, we do want to start to share this with the with the stakeholders. Okay. Kathy, can you talk a little bit about the Lower Deer Creek watershed plan and fill this group in on that presentation that was last week?
Sure. I think some of you know that the Pixley Irrigation District, GSA, received a grant to develop a plan, EA/IS. So the plan is going to cover NEPA and CEQA under what we call Public Law 566. And I'm learning, you know, I've been working on it for almost a year and a half, and I'm learning more and more of the criteria and some of the limitations. But we're looking at just the Lower Deer Creek, which we found out is not 190,000 acres. It's really only 124,000 acres. And the PL 566 is a watershed program and flood management program that typically is not utilized in California. So the project proposal was put together with the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, the Water District, and with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And we're looking at retirement, or I call it conversion, of up to 20,000 acres of existing farmland to either wildlife-friendly recharge basins. I think about 2,000 acres they're identifying up along the Deer Creek in high-quality groundwater recharge areas. And then the remaining lands would be conservation easements on properties that a landowner would like to take out of production in order to get into balance on their groundwater. So it's got restrictions. We had a public meeting last week and the public comment period is still open. And I know we've talked about the WRP wetlands that are within Tri-County, and any kind of modification on those types of properties that are already in habitat wouldn't meet the PL 566. So we're looking at a couple of other options. We'll be implementing this plan as we've described, but thanks to Carol Combs and the Tulare Basin Watershed Partners, she alerted the group to the Watershed Coordinator Grant Program, and I've talked to Deanna about this. So I've been drafting a grant proposal to the Department of Conservation. And the role of that watershed coordinator will be similar to what the Wildlife Partners had. Now it's the Watershed Partnership that we did back in 2011 to 2014. But that the role of that watershed coordinator will not only be to implement the PL 566, which is on Lower Deer Creek, but they'll also be going out and working with the area, pretty much the Tule subbasin, on these other projects that have multi-benefit benefits that you guys, I know, are very interested in. So it seemed like it was a little discouraging to people when they found out the constraints of the PL 566, the Lower Deer Creek watershed plan that Pixley's doing. But we are looking at expanding this and working on getting other funding. Right now, the Nature Conservancy is negotiating with the Bureau of Reclamation on some significant funds for the upland restoration piece. So as landowners are looking over the next 5 to 10 years to looking at land coming out of production and wanting some kind of compensation, that may be part of the PL 566. We may be able to compensate them for retiring land, and then reclamation is stepping up and maybe doing some of the restoration. So that was a long-winded explanation, but we are hoping that the watershed plan will be done by the end of the year, and we can start implementing some of this. But some of the comments that we're getting right now is, water rights on the, floodwater and things on the Deer Creek. That's being noted that, we don't want to have upstream diversions that are going to impact downstream, particularly these WRP wetlands.
Thank you, Kathy. I was just actually going to reiterate what Kathy just said there. Is one of the comments that Tri-County had was to make sure that the existing wetlands that we do have, that while we completely 100% support these projects and the plan itself, we do want to make sure that it doesn't impact our ability to utilize those existing wetlands, because we want to make sure that those have already been built and are in place. The other thing I would mention to all the stakeholders on the call today, if you have an interest in any of the property, it's as Kathy said, we are taking the PL 566 takes existing ag land out of production and turns it either into habitat or a wildlife friendly recharge basin. So if you have property that you're interested, please contact myself, Deanna, Kathy directly, and let us know, because while we would be interested in getting more land into this program, and if anyone does have or just wants more information, reach out to Deanna, reach out to Kathy directly, and we'd be happy to try and get you as much information as we can, and see if we can get your project into this program. All right.
This Brandon, yeah, could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I apologize, I may have missed it, but was there any discussion in terms of benefits to the landowner who's interested in looking at this type of project? I missed that part. Yes,
actual payments for the easement.
Okay.
That's the really benefit of this PL 566. We can actually, and then they've created the Tule Land and Water Conservation Trust that can hold the easement. The water right piece, then what you do is you use your water someplace else within your property, but the land then goes to this upland, possibly the upland habitat or other uses. We're just looking at if we do the restoration, we're looking at, funding that as well. But if you have other uses on this land, it's not telling you that you can't do a solar field or do something else, but taking the land out of production and ideally putting it back into habitat.
Hey, Kathy, Steve, this is a question for you too, follow up with Brandon. What kind of dollars are we talking about?
You know, for the initial, they've kind of thrown out $2 to $5 million for land acquisition. And then we've been hearing for the restoration, we've been hearing up to $10 million for restoration. So it's a pretty, like I say, it's the first time we've done something like this, and especially since it's tied to Sigma. So just because we're staying focused on Lower Deer Creek and this 124, this is a small watershed program. So you have to stay under 250,000 acres, but it doesn't mean we can't do this someplace else within the area and come in with a grant, because the grant just to write the watershed plan was over $500,000. And, you know, that we're doing an economic analysis, and I think it really helps inform our area as we're going forward in Sigma, you know, at least in the short term. But, you know, after 5 years, after we get our monitoring and get some of our data together, I would hope that this kind of catches on so that landowners have some kind of an economic benefit for taking their land out of production and utilizing the water, the groundwater elsewhere, but doing this restoration, because I think it's a win-win for habitat and for the groundwater.
I guess my question probably should have been, Kathy, is how much would that be per acre to a grower to retire his land? Because, you know, we got significant investments. So I'm just curious, this 5 million sounds like a lot, but I mean, you're looking at $20,000 to $40,000 an acre investment on ground that doesn't go very far.
It's $200 an acre.
Well, no, I think it's going to have to be, I think, yes, there's going to have to be an appraisal.
It's all going to come down to the capital that we have invested out there and how that, you know, how that's going to entice retire.
Right, but I think the reality, and I'm just talking here as a member of the public now, I think the reality that we all know is that there's going to be land retirement. And you're right. I think we need to look at that analysis. I think when we get the plan out, look at the economic analysis. But I would hope that we can somewhat mitigate for lands being retired with some sort of compensation. And you're right. I don't know what that's going to be.
Carol, it sounds like you want to add something.
Yeah, I have 2 points. As the first is an informational item, and this is regarding strategic, both identification of of habitat areas, listed species habitat areas as a priority. If this happens, there are 2 potential sources of funding for landowners. One being Caltrans, a woman named Kari Daniska. Stacey Ann was involved in the meeting where we had information about this yesterday. The Caltrans, she is a biologist with Caltrans. Caltrans is holding a meeting for District 6, which this area is in, on August 21st from 1 to 3. It's going to be a webinar, and they're going to make available a list of species they need credits for in this region. So very significant, a range of funding, but depending on the species, apparently a very significant range of funding will be available from Caltrans. It's mitigation funding. Then secondly, another strategic opportunity would be if the parcels a landowner identifies has listed species involved, then the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership conceptual area protection plan document for the corridor, then which Deer Creek was the highest priority. That can be a funding route depending on the value of the species for funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board.
Okay, great. No, thank you. That's an addition to the funding that that Kathy's been talking about.
Yeah,
So,
just to
Kathy,
clarify, Amir, just to clarify, this is on lands that are already in production. I think Steve made a good point, is that, the cost per acre is going to be really high. And then it's great, Carol, thank you for sharing this other, because that piece, we can look at strategic acquisition, in the area. But I agree with Steve. It's we're going to have to sort out what the costs are going to be. But this is on lands that are currently in ag production that are coming out.
so Kathy, just to be clear, how is that number, when and how is that number derived? Is that going to be part of the study at the end? The economic analysis is going to say that a land value is going to be X. If I'm a landowner who's interested in this program, how would I go about finding out that information?
Well,
Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. And my answer is I don't know. I know we have the economic analysis, and that goes to NRCS, and they will look at the program to see even if it's viable, because this is really their plan. And then that way we can bring funding through the PL 566. My experience with PL 566 was in the Great Plains, and usually you built, like on one place, there was a small dam, water diversion to prevent flooding into the community of Canyon, Texas, built quite a while ago. So there was a lot of that flood management in these small, flashy watersheds. So this is something new. So I don't know, but I will, if you want to send me an email, I'll send it over to our economics person.
Okay. I think we will do that just from a Tri-County standpoint, just so that we can share with any of our stakeholders, what information we have, and see if any of them might be interested in pursuing this program. All right, good. Thank you, Kathy. That was helpful, and I think there's some good information there. All right, so let me get into part 3 of our agenda on the implementation. And if before I jump in, is there any other questions? I'm sorry if I don't want to cut the conversation short. If someone else had any questions that they wanted to ask. All right. Hearing nothing, I'm going to keep moving on. On implementation, there's 3 parts to this that we're going to talk about. One is we've revised the meter policy quite a bit, and if you were at the last board meeting, you've probably seen this revised meter policy. But I'm going to walk the group through it, and then we are going to send out a revised draft out to this group again, ask you to take a look at it and make some final comments. The plan is to have it before the board in their September meeting. Is that right? The end of September, right?
Yes, correct. September 3rd.
Yeah, September 3rd. And so we want to kind of revise, get this thing finalized and implemented right away, and have the board approve it in September. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope can you all see that? Can you see my screen?
You can see it. It's a little small, but I can see it.
Okay.
I would magnify a little bit there, Mayor.
Let me see if I can. Does that help?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to talk about the changes that were made to the document. And again, as I said, if you were at the last board meeting, you'll be familiar with these already. We got input from legal on this, and so we've added an actual resolution here for the board to approve, and that's what this first page or so is essentially an actual resolution for them to approve the water meter policy, and then getting into the policy itself now. One of the things I noted as I was going through the coordination agreement for the Tule subbasin, there's actually a discussion in that document about the use of meters. So one of the things that we did in this policy is to make sure that this policy is in line with the Tule subbasin agreement and make sure that it matches up with what's required in the coordination agreement. Lots of moving parts to this that you don't always realize when people put these documents together. So we want to make sure everything matched up. So one thing that we did in section 2 here, where it says that it would apply to all non-domestic groundwater wells that pump more than 70 gallons a minute or the 2 acre-feet per year. This 70 gallons a minute was added per the coordination agreement. The meter requirements are very similar to what's in the coordination agreement in terms of the references to the different standards. What we did, we did add some requirements as to the APN requirement, and then we eliminated some of the requirements that were on the installation. So initially we had a lot of requirements to say it was installed for the, certified that it was installed in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications and et cetera. And we eliminated all of those types of requirements in here. The recording schedule is very similar. The calibration schedule is similar to what you've seen in the past. The non-conforming meters, we actually give you a little bit more time. We modified that to October 1 of 21. And then we added this whole new section here, item 6, which is the data confidentiality. And we referenced the government code that would allow us to keep this information confidential and only provide the data in aggregate to anyone who would ask. So rather than down to a individual well or meter or even field level, we're looking at the aggregate data over large areas, and that's what we would have to provide and make publicly available. We also added the information here on item number 7 on the enforcement, and we specifically referenced back to the enforcement and penalties policies that was approved by the board in the last board meeting. And then the due dates for the compliance are pretty much the same as you see. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the one that we changed this here is the October 1st, and we just gave everybody a little bit more time to make sure it matched up with what we had. So the totalizer readings matches up. And that's it. So at this point, oh, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. We did add this attachment A, which includes additional information on the meter itself, the longitude, latitude, the brand, and then allows people to have a form that they can fill out. Obviously, the information up here just needs to be filled out once, and and then you would go into the totalizer readings. And then this is the form that would be returned back to Tri-County. We are looking at possibilities of, obviously making this into a web portal so that you could log on at some point in the future and provide this data electronically is what we would hope. But in the meantime, as we're kind of starting to get this off the ground and start to collect this information, at this time, we're just going to ask everyone to submit it via email, this form here. And I know I went through that rather quickly, but what I do want to do is like I said, is send this out to everyone, give you a chance to look at it in more detail, read through it, and then get us comments here by the middle of August, and so that we can be prepared to have a final version in front of the board by the next board meeting in September. Questions or comments on the final meter policy, or the final draft of the meter policy, I should say? Anything I can clarify for anyone?
Mayor, just a point of clarification. I know there was some discussion about the meter readings not going directly to Tri-County, but that has been changed with this policy, correct? The meter readings will be delivered directly to the GSA?
Yes, that is correct. Yes. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to keep moving on here. All right, so the next part is the allocation. And there's two parts that I want to talk to the group about allocation. We have an outline of the allocation report, and I want to go through that with this group. And then secondly, as many of you probably are aware, one of our neighboring Eastern Thule GSA has come up with their draft allocation methodology. And I wanted to take just a few minutes at the end here and walk this group through that, the allocation method that they're using as well. I think as I go through the allocation outline of this report, I do want to point out that this is where, some of the updates to the model are going to be really important, because we're using some of that data out of the model, and we want to make sure that we're comfortable with that data, and that we feel that that data does represent what is actually going on. So let me share this with you. So this is the outline, and again, let me blow this up and see if that helps. Deanna or anyone, does that something you can read, or is that too small still?
It's all right. It's a little small, but it's okay.
All right,
Yeah, if you could blow it up a little bit, that would help us.
yeah, is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right. So this is the outline of the document. I'm going to just touch on some specific items. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I think it's important that we talk about in 1.3, for example, we look at the Thule Lake subbasin. We're going to talk about how those water budgets were derived. And then if you get into 1.4, we're going to be focused in on how the Tri-County water budget in particular, and how that number was what that number is in the model, and how what went into that. Steve had mentioned that earlier in this call. He had mentioned that we had some ongoing discussions about how the Thule Lake subbasin water budgets and the decisions that were made that went into that. And I think I might have mentioned this to the group before. The coordination agreement essentially says that any imported water, which is surface water coming into the area, once it leaves the channel that it's being brought in. So, we're not talking, Deer Creek, for example, but once it's diverted from that channel, any of those recharge that occurs due to that diversion belongs to the owner of that water and who brought the imported water in. So we were looking at a sustainable yield of about 340,000 or so, 360,000, excuse me, sustainable yield for the subbasin, and they then subtracted out about 240 of that for imported water. This is recharged due to that imported water. And subsequently, the remainder of the sustainable yield then was divided up over the acreage of each GSA. And the sustainable yield that it stands right now for Tri-County is 22,000 acre feet. So we are looking at that. We're trying to come up with an evaluation of why and how those numbers were derived, and then offering up some alternatives. But that's an ongoing process, and it would take some time and effort to make some changes to that. So we are still moving forward with allocation. I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression here. So getting back, sorry, I digress there a little bit, but as we're getting back to some of the key issues here on the allocation, one of the big ones, of course, is the ramp down period. The GSP has a very steep ramp down of only 10 years. As you all know, Sigma allows for a 20-year time frame. We've made some recommendations back to Tri-County and to the board to look at modifying that. And this is something that we would want some input from this group on that issue, and some guidance from this issue on that issue from this group. We are also looking the sustainable yield for the subbasin does not discuss or differentiate between the upper and lower aquifer. This is meaning above and below the Corcoran clay, the E-clay. And so that is also a key issue that I think needs a lot of discussion with this group as well, and trying to figure out exactly, should we have a different allocation for pumping in the upper aquifer versus the lower aquifer. The lower aquifer is a confined aquifer, so it recharges very slowly. The upper aquifer, there is, obviously there's some concerns about water quality and some other issues in the upper aquifer in some areas. The third item is the consumptive use patterns and how that's calculated. And this gets back to our previous discussion on exactly how Land IQ is, how the Land IQ ET data is then going to be converted into groundwater extraction and groundwater pumping rate. So the missing component, of course, is land use and cropping distribution, and then how surface water is subtracted out of all of this for those that do have surface water rights. So we want to look at that a lot more carefully and make sure that the data that's being used is truly representative of what's going on the ground today, and take into account, for example, the irrigation efficiencies that many of you have implemented. Fourth item, of course, is boundary flow, and this is one of those ongoing discussions that I'm sure is going to be a critical part of Sigma. But right now, if you look at what's as groundwater moves across the different GSAs across the subbasins, and we want to make sure that that subbasin flow and that there continues to happen, and so that one GSA doesn't impact the ability of another GSA to achieve sustainability. So if you look at historical flows before before we were out here and the dams and everything were built, how was groundwater moving? What direction was it moving? And at what kind of boundary flow should we expect, not only between the individual GSAs, but our neighboring subbasins as well? What does, in terms of what's leaving the subbasin or flowing into the subbasin? If you remember, one of the letters that we received was from the Kern subbasin about water flowing in, some 21,000 acre feet, I believe, every year annually flowing into our subbasin. And then the same thing applies to the Tulare Lake subbasin, the amount of groundwater that's flowing naturally into the Tulare Lake subbasin. So, those are all discussions. Part of the issue, of course, is that the Tule subbasin model might show one activity occurring, groundwater flow moving in a certain direction, and that some of the neighboring models actually show the opposite of that. So there's still some ongoing discussions on what that boundary flow conditions are actually going to be. All of these obviously impact the allocation because we're looking at the water available. And as we look at the water balance, the boundary flow coming in and leaving is part of that water balance. So that becomes an important part of that discussion. The hydrologic variability and uncertainty, that basically is dealing with the wet years versus the dry years and what kind of changes in allocation are going to occur between or due to that variability. So are you looking at what type of allocation number would you be looking at in a dry year versus a wet year? And how do you credit for the wet years? And then finally, the ramp up on any surface water or storage new projects that might be built over the course of this, and how and what type of credits would be allocated for those projects as they're built. So let me stop. I know I covered a lot of ground. These are all some very key issues that I think we want to get into a lot deeper with this group, and we'd love to get more feedback from this group and your input on all of these and how you think some of these should be handled. I'm sure there's going to be a variety of different opinions, but let me stop just for a second and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions, or I can clarify any of what I said for you.
This is Brandon. I guess first and foremost, in terms of feedback, are you looking for feedback today, or is there some time we have to maybe circle up as a group within our company to discuss and bring some information back?
Yeah, no, Brandon, I'm not looking for it just today. I absolutely would encourage you to do exactly that.
Yeah.
These are not simple yes or no type questions. And
Sure.
and as you make a decision on one of these 6 items, it does have an impact on the other 5. And so, yeah, I would strongly encourage you to sit down with your organizations and have that discussion and give us your feedback as to how you would like to see those handled as the allocation.
Got it. All right, and another question on the upper versus lower aquifer zones. If I heard correctly, Tri-County will be looking at them basically as the same aquifer. Neither is counted differently. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So right now they're treated as essentially one allocation, but one of the things we are seeking some input from this group is, should we be looking at a different allocation for the upper versus the lower? I think I've mentioned previously, and some of you know, that Westlands, the GSA in Westlands, the subbasin in Westlands, has basically said that they're going to give a different pumping allocation in the upper zone versus the lower zone. And so we're looking for some input back from you as to is that something that we should explore in more detail. It may not pertain in all parts of Tri-County due to the river or the lake bottom, excuse me, but in areas where there is a more defined upper and lower aquifer where there's usable water, we're looking for some input on that.
Hey, Amir, this is Kathy again. Do you have kind of an analysis? I know we had some work done between the upper and lower of where there's better quality upper aquifer, where they could possibly pump, because I know when we were considering it out on the BLM property, we were looking at the longevity of the new well. We were looking at water quality issues, you know, from the standpoint of habitat and wildlife. But I'm just curious to see if you have some mapping of the upper versus the lower and water quality.
We have some, I think, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know Ken Schmidt has some maps that were prepared as part of the GSP.
Those numbers too.
You know, I mean, Mark's right next to me here, but yeah, we have the Angela wells. We have all that information, you know. On that.
So Kathy, we have some of that in some areas. In the southeast area, frankly, we have limited information. There just hasn't been that much work done. And so we're still, as they're installing wells and as we're measuring water levels, and as we're talking to some of the landowners in the area, we're still gathering that and trying to get a better handle on exactly the depth of the wells and if they do have water quality data. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you because there's just a limited amount of data.
Yeah, I consulted with Ken, asked him when we were looking at the well on the BLM property, and we're going down 1,000 feet, and it's going to be the only well. I think Tim's on the call too. So we kind of got an answer there, but I was just curious over the other areas, just a curiosity.
Yeah, I think we have some better data in Angiola because they've did some more investigations up in that area, and just limited data set in the southeast area for right now. Okay, so let me kind of finalize or finish off this discussion. So essentially, once we've gone through this evaluation, we're going to give some options for allocation, the different methodologies, and then some recommendations back to the board, obviously to this group and the board as to what we recommend, and then not just an actual, not just a methodology, but then actual numbers associated with that as well. We're trying to be, and I don't mean to be coy, but we're trying to play a little bit close to our vest on the numbers, because I know that the minute I put a number out there, everyone's going to focus in on that value. And I'd rather have all of us as the stakeholders agree on a methodology, agree on some of these issues, on some of these key issues that I mentioned up here, come up with a methodology and a procedure, and then we can come through and say, okay, if we do this, the value, the allocation is going to be this amount. And I know that's a lot. I'm sure all of you are anxious to get to the allocation numbers as quickly as we can. What I'd like to do next is kind of walk you through what Eastern Thule did, and then what I've told Deanna is
Have we lost Amir?
Yeah, we lost Amir. There you are. You're muted, Amir.
I apologize. I meant to hit the stop sharing button and I hit the hang up button instead. Sorry. Amateur move. I'm sorry. You would think after 3 months of this, we'd all be better, or at least I would be better. Sorry about that. So let me show you what Eastern Thule is doing.
Mayor, if I could just on the Eastern Thule provide clarification that this is not their final allocation policy. And this document hasn't gone to their committees yet. The basis of it has, but the document has not.
But it is for public, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
Okay,
and it's
okay, all right,
scheduled to go before the board in August. But I just wanted to make sure that it was understood that this was not their final.
Right. That is that readable, or is that too small?
It's pretty small on my screen.
Is it still too small? All right, let me see if I can. How's that?
Much better.
Is it too much? Is that better, Steve?
That's better there. I think if you move it around, we could see it now.
Okay. All right. So let me walk you guys through this. And what we're going to do is kind of take this as one of our examples because, this is something that some of the other GSAs are doing in the subbasin. We are not advocating for this. We are not commenting necessarily on whether it's the right way to do it or not. I just want to make the group aware of, at least if you're not already familiar with this, of how some of the other GSAs are at least looking at this as a draft. So buckets of water, that essentially is, each of the units that we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to go through every single column. We can certainly make this available to everybody. But first and foremost, they're looking at precipitation, and at least in Eastern Thule, that number is about 0.87 acre feet. We would do is use a value for precipitation that was included in our annual report. And we would just divide that up and basically say that the per acre number across Tri-County would be value X, right? So we would just say, okay, we're going to use that value, and this is what each acre will receive in terms of precipitation. The number 2 is a native sustainable yield, and this is the one that is an ongoing discussion, but that sustainable yield right now for Tri-County is shown at 22,000 acre feet. So we would take that number, divide that by the entire acreage across Tri-County, and that would be the sustainable yield. So every acre of land in Tri-County would receive some of the sustainable yield. That includes the BLM, that includes the wetlands, it includes fallow land, it includes land in production, of course.
Mayor Lucien,
yes.
for clarification, that 22,000 acre feet is just the Thule subbasin. So
yes, just the Thule subbasin. Yes. Yes, it is just the Thule subbasin. Yes, thank you, Deanna. That's a good clarification.
Mayor, if I can, and I apologize if you were getting here, but this 0.09 acre feet per acre in Eastern Thule's is their sustainable yield minus the precipitation recharge that is included in the full sustainable yield. So for example, if you take the 22,000 over all that Tri-County has over the Thule subbasin portion of it, you'll get a number that's similar to the Eastern Thule per acre foot number that includes precip recharge. So that's just an important difference to note on those numbers.
Yes, thank you. That is absolutely true. So we don't want to double count anything. We want to be careful that, and that's a very good point, that we don't want to double count anything. So landowner credits, item number 3, these would be the credits that you would receive for projects. And these are essentially coming, if you are looking at carryover from year to year, if you didn't use all of your allocation, or if you purchase additional allocation, and that's essentially your credits that you would be looking at for the landowners. How we do that, that may be something that is part of the discussion with this group of how you want to give those groundwater credits. The surface water credits, as we kind of talked about, are going to be some of the new projects. If you bring in water, you participate in a surface water project that brings in water into the southeast area. How do we credit you for that? How long do those credits last? Who gets the credit for those projects, and at what, how would we divvy that up? And then finally, it gets into this transitional pumping. And Eastern Thule did an interesting way. They essentially looked at the calculated overdraft without surface water, which was, as you can see, is about 112,000 acre feet per year. And they reduced it over, that 5-year periods between 2020 and 2035. So you can see that 90% of that is in the first 5 years, and then 80% in the next, and 30%. So as you take the 1.1 million and divvy it up over this 15-year period. And by 2035, 2040, there's no credit for transitional pumping. So Bob and I looked at the GSP, and we looked at the model, and we looked at the annual report, and all of them have a different number for the overdraft value for Tri-County in the Thule subbasin. And so we're going to be working together with Deanna and others to try and figure out what we might want to use as our transitional volume, and then calculate that and say, okay, if we were to do something similar. Now, I'm not advocating that we do the 90-80% like they have here necessarily. So that's also one of the items that is up for discussion. So let me pause just a bit. Well, I'll tell you what, let me finish this off. I think there's a key issue here, and that's at tier 2. So you have a transitional pumping, and then if you exceed that transitional pumping, Eastern Thule actually has it set up as a penalty. And this is in excess of the tier 1 pumping that you have up here. And then they have some additional fees associated with that. So the transitional pumping, they are looking at somewhere between $200 to $250 per acre foot, and the tier 2 excess pumping would be in around $500 per acre foot consumed. So in Eastern Thule, they're charging you for the transitional pumping. And even if you exceed that, and then they charge you some additional money on top of that for the penalty. The discussion so far with Tri-County has not been, we haven't gotten into the details of whether that would be something that would be acceptable to Tri-County or not, and it would be an ongoing discussion, and what that number should be in terms of dollar per acre foot pumped in both tier 1 and tier 2. So we're still having those discussions, what makes sense, and more importantly, if you do charge this, what do we use the money for? Where's that money going to go? Who, should we be looking at, is it critical infrastructure projects? Is it repair projects? Is it projects to try and bring in more money, or excuse me, more water, not more money, but more water? Where would that money be used? So I covered a lot of ground on this one too, and I want to open this up for some questions and some comments from each of you, and see if you have some thoughts on the Eastern Thule method that they used, if there were parts that you liked or didn't like, or I raised a bunch of questions. Do you feel that the 200 or 250 an acre foot, is that for the transitional pumping, is that something that seems to make sense for the group, and we use the money for to try and bring in other water supply? So let me kind of open it up. We've got about 20 minutes or so, and get some feedback from this group as to what you would like to see and your thoughts on the Eastern Thule method.
Mayor, if I may, I track the Eastern Thule pretty closely, so we've been working with this allocation for a while. Just for some clarity, that 200 to 250 per acre foot was actually prescribed to them by Friant as the amount they would need to correct or to pay for the canal fix to sustain the additional subsidence that would be caused by the transitional pumping. So that's how they came to that number.
Yeah.
Stacey, that's interesting, because that was going to be my question. My question is, I haven't had a chance to really review what Eastern Thule did, but my question was, how are they going to handle the pumping that we know there's a cluster of wells right along the Friant? So that 2 to 250 would be directly for that measure, because without some sort of restriction of the pumping right along there, the subsidence isn't going to abate at all.
Well, and that's a separate issue, actually, because they put out a rules and regulations document yesterday that singles out an allocation for the greater Thule management area, and then a to be determined allocation for the land subsidence management area, which is that area along the canal. But that's exactly what that money is for. The 868 is at the top is their estimated admin cost. And then the 200 to 250 is a number that Friant has given them. And all of that transitional pumping money is slated to go to fixing the canal for additional subsidence caused by transitional pumping.
Thank you.
Stacey Ann, do you know what other type of feedback they've received so far? I don't want to concentrate too much on Eastern Thule, but I want to talk a little bit about how this methodology could be applied to us, and don't worry about the exact numbers. We can we'll get the numbers to work for Tri-County, but I'm just wondering if you had some other feedback on the methodology itself. Did it seem like is this something that would work for Tri-County?
I can't necessarily speak on if this is something that can work for Tri-County, because I think that's a conversation that needs to happen in a place other than myself. But as far as how Eastern Thule handled it, this was a product of a very long conversation. They analyzed, similar to Amir, what you and Bob have presented, they analyzed the different legal types of allocation. And this was their way of striking a balance. You'll notice that the native yield is per gross acre, but transitional pumping is only allocated to those acres that are actively farmed, whether that they be identified through the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program or the dairy program. And so that was how they decided on striking a balance between per gross acre and historic use. The one thing I will note that I think that Tri-County will need to take into consideration is they initially had transitional water or transitional volume being allocated on a yearly basis, and they realized pretty quickly that that was going to put people out of water year one. And so you'll notice at the bottom that transitional allocation is allocated for the first 3 years, the allocation comes in 2020. And then after that, you get 1 year added on to it. So they front loaded their allocation in a way to help ease the transition.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. I know we're kind of, you know, a lot of you haven't had a chance to look in detail at this, and Stacey Ann's absolutely right. There's a rules and regulations. A draft of that came out yesterday too, which I didn't go into. It's multiple pages, but I wanted to at least show that what others are doing and some of the how they're handling some of these issues and trying to come up with. So, you know, it's easy to, you know, it sounds like, oh, an allocation should be fairly straightforward, but when you start getting into some of these details, there's a lot of nuances that need to be discussed and input from each of the stakeholders. So, any thoughts or ideas in terms of groundwater credits? And I guess, you know, any questions on the transitional pumping? You guys are a quiet group today. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm just going to chime in here for a minute. I know we've been looking at, you know, the basin itself has been looking at a lot of different allocations. You know, we've probably looked around and seen we're bordered by people that have gone down this road. We are somewhat unique in that we have a big wide area, so we're not in the same boat as Eastern Tule, but we're pretty closely aligned to what they're dealing with there as well. So I know we've had, and Dean would probably say this too, we've had a lot of landowner input as to where we're going. But I think and I'll put my stakeholder hat on, just representing stakeholder, we want to go down a route that will give us some certainty, I'll put it that way, so that we know what we have. And I think what you started out with saying first is that we need to look at what our model, what we're allocated in Tri-County. If we can nail that down, I'd like to get going on something that's will give us some certainty. And that's why I was looking at this too and seeing what they're doing out there. But we do need to focus on numbers that we can support, but we also need to have some, you know, start putting some numbers out there that we can all look at.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Steve. I agree with you. I think it's nice to do these presentations, but at some point we got to start talking real numbers. And if we talk a methodology, you know, what do the different methodologies actually result in terms of actual numbers for, you know, for the individual stakeholders and the individual growers out here. I think Stacey Ann made a really good point that, and this is the way that I'm personally kind of leaning towards, is that if you're going to do transitional pumping, it really, you know, it needs to be focused in on the land in production, you know, at the time or so that the GSP was prepared and submitted, which is, you know, January of this year. So if land was in production in January 31st, you know, does that qualify for the transitional pumping, or is there some other timeline that we should consider for that land in production? So there's lots of thoughts, and I'd like to get as much, you know, feedback from all of you. If that means that you'd prefer to have some of these conversations offline, I'm more than happy to do that, and you know, get your thoughts on all these. We are going to go ahead and in fact, Bob and I yesterday evening kind of went through this and said, okay, you know, what would happen if we put in Tri-County's numbers, and we've got some values that we're going to have some discussions with Deanna about in more detail, and then start to to refine this a little bit and then present it back as one of the alternatives back to the group. But Steve's right. We've got to kind of nail down some of those key issues that I mentioned, from the previous presentation.
Amir, for a time frame, do we think we're going to have something similar to this document to go out to the group in the next few weeks for them to give us feedback before the next advisory committee meeting?
So I'd like to have some numbers, this being one method, and then looking at other methods that we can share with the advisory group within the before the next meeting. I'd like to be able to have those discussions with you first, Deanna, and kind of run those numbers by you guys, and then share them with the group so that we can have some conversations at the next tag meeting. So yes, I guess that was a long way to answer your question. Is a yes.
Okay, thank you.
but I do want to have multiple methods, I guess, is what I am trying to say. I don't want to just stick to one. I'm sorry if I'm beating a dead horse, but I know the minute we have some numbers out there, those numbers are going to get implanted as being gospel, and that's not the case at all. These are very preliminary numbers and are going to be subject to huge changes based on some decisions we make on some of those key issues and input from all the stakeholders and revisions to the model. I think I've hedged my bets there quite a bit. Anything else I can answer for the group? No? Okay, in that case, I'm going to go ahead. Just quickly, I'm going to mention the fact that we're still looking at some of the Bureau WaterSmart grants and looking at coming up with some projects. There's a couple of different grant opportunities from the Bureau I mentioned last time. One, of course, is the efficiency grants, and we're looking at potentially if you need to install meters. I don't think that's a huge one for this particular GSA. And then the second one is a grant that would be available next calendar year, and that would allow us to look at getting money to evaluate a water market and do an actual water market study and implement even a pilot program for water markets. But unfortunately, that second grant won't be available until or isn't due until May of next year. So we've got a little bit of time there, but any other grant opportunities that do come up, we're obviously interested. We want to get that information out to the group. All right, our next meeting is scheduled for August 26th. We will send out an agenda and a meeting, a Teams meeting notice for all of you well ahead of time. In the meantime, I want to share with you the meter policy, the updated meter policy, and the hopefully some allocation numbers, some draft values that we can share and have ready for discussion. And then finally, as we kind of talked about, we'll work with Kathy to see if we can come up with some additional information on the watershed plan and the value, the amount of money that may be available to those that might want to participate in that plan as well. All right, well, that's all I had for the group. Are there any questions, or Deanna or Steve, if you want to add anything before we wrap this meeting up?
No, I think that's great. I see it's interesting to see what the others are doing, and I'm assuming that we'll come up with some sort of hybrid that takes into consideration tri-counties. We have a different we have a different need because we overlaid 2 subbasins. And so in addition to the wide area, then we have a district that's moving water. So I know we're going to need to do a hybrid, but it is very interesting to look at what others are doing. And the group should note that we're going to have something very similar. There will be an allocation, and there will be a ramp down of some sort. And again, any input that we can get as we send things out will be helpful, and we welcome it always.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amir, I would just add too, I think the sustainable yield is going to be important that we really know what we have out there. Before we go out with a number, I think all of us need to know what we have. And I know what the coordination agreement overlies that as well, but you and I have discussed, there's a little bit of some issues. And I think going forward too, I think it's clear with the group, and I know Deanna and I have talked about this, this is something the board would need to look at every year. Whenever we come up with this policy, we need to be looking at some of these numbers annually and see how groundwater elevations are responding and how the conditions are in the field. So I think we can rely upon models, but the models are only going to help us so much. We're going to have to true it up with what actually conditions are on the ground. So
Right.
we got our work cut out. I think we're going the right direction, Amir, and I think we're definitely going to be headed. Whenever the department at some point will get back to us, I don't know. Hopefully, COVID moved it out another 6 months, but I know the department will get back to us on these plans at some point. So I feel better with this discussions that we're having. We'll be further down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you said, Steve. I think it's going to be important, and there, whatever allocation we set, there's going to be changes and modifications and some flexibility in those numbers because, as I already mentioned, wet, dry years and all kinds of other things are going to have impacts. And as we see what water levels are actually doing in response to the numbers we're putting out there when we implement these policies, we want to have the ability to adjust those appropriately and give the stakeholders and landowners some flexibility.
Yeah, as Deanna always says, these are adaptive plans, Amir.
These are adaptive plans. Yes, I agree.
Freaking that.
That's right.
Yeah. So, last thing, anyone who does, I want to at least open it up to any of the stakeholders. Do you have anything you want to add before? If there's a particular topic that you'd like us to address in these meetings, please let us know. And if not, I think we're good for today. Thank you, everybody. Have a good and stay safe and have a good rest of your day. And we've got the next meeting on August 26th and the board meeting on September 3rd. All right. Thanks all.
Thank you, Amir.
Thanks.